second day of the workshop. We are in the fourth session this morning, and the session title is Large-Scale Dams in the Nile Basin and the Relevance for Regional Agriculture and Energy Agenda. Yesterday, poor Saif Hamad was sitting amongst three political scientists. I think my situation is worse today because I'm sitting with three engineers, but I'm trying to survive it. We have three speakers, Kevin Wheeler, Brent Ballard, and Yasser. Before we start the first presentation by Kevin, I'm going to take a few minutes just to walk you quickly through some basic facts about the GERD. Largest dam in Africa and 10th largest in the world. It's on the Blue Nile, 20 kilometers from the Sudanese borders. The height is about 45 meters. Reservoir capacity about 74 billion cubic meters. Installed capacity 6,000 megawatts, not 5,000, 6,000 megawatts. 16 turbines, 335 each. The cost of close to 4 billion. Construction is done by the Salini, the Italian company, turbines by Alstom Siemens, and power link lines by the Chinese. This is where it lies in the border of Sudan, the Blue Nile. This is in relation to the whole Nile Basin. Close to 6% is complete, and according to Ethiopian announcement, is on schedule. Poised for completion on time next year. Vehemently rejected by Egypt 2011 to 2013. Initially rejected by Sudan, gradual acceptance, and final acceptance came in December 2013. Finally, both Sudan and Egypt accepted the GERD through two legal instruments. The Agreement on Declaration of Principles, which was signed in March 23, 2015, and the Khartoum document, which was signed in December 2015. The question we have raised is the beginning an era of cooperation in the Nile Basin. After this, this is a GERD in 2014, and this is in 2016. After this brief presentation, we'll move to the first speaker, Kevin Wheeler, doing a research PhD at Oxford University. And Kevin will talk about minimizing downstream risks through coordinating filling strategies of the GERD. Kevin, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it is working.
Kevin.
Okay. We'll give you half a minute extra.
I'm going to change the norms by speaking up at the front. I think it's a little better to talk to everybody and point to the screen from here. It's always an honor to talk to this group. I've been working on the Nile for only 5 years, and people here have been working on it their whole lives. So I'm always very honored to have the opportunity to study such an amazing place with all over the basin.
Kevin, can you put the microphone closer to?
Is this working better?
Yes, working better.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to talk about rationale, methods, some of the key results and the way forward, but in a very, very brief manner here, and open to questions later on. So overall, the hydrology of the Nile, I like to start with this always. This is a schematic of the Nile where the thicknesses represent the amount of water. About 30% of the water from the White Nile, about 57% of the water from the Blue Nile, and 13% of the water from the Atbata that flows into the Aswan Dam for 100%. And from that 57%, about 53% comes from above the GERD. So roughly half of the water that flows in the Aswan Dam flows through the location of the GERD. At this location. Okay, so the rationale for this study is to understand the probabilistic impacts. Not just talking about simple, wet, dry average, but the probabilistic, and do more of a risk-based analysis. Explore some creative cooperative solutions to maximize benefits, minimize risks of the GERD. So this is an independent study that is not funded by any of the governments. Not funded. Originally, it started out the model development by an intro contract, but for many years it's been just independent without any financial support. Highly collaborative. People from all three of the different ministries have contributed knowledge to this. Some have been co-authors on it, all the universities, and it's an unofficial study. So the idea is to provide ideas that the consultants, the French consultants, could potentially use in their own studies. But of course, this is not an official study whatsoever. Okay, so increasing degrees of cooperation and coordination. And the idea is coordination and cooperation is a continuum. It's not binary. Either unilateral on one side or integration on the other side. There's many ways to cooperate on producing dams and reservoirs, to operate them differently, to cooperate in different ways. So facts, risks always exist. Always, even today they exist. There's risks to Egypt today. Non-cooperation will increase risks, and risks are always best managed in a cooperative manner. These are facts. So some of the methods we use. So since 2012, we've been developing this model. All 3 countries, over 20 visits. I've done 7 different training sessions of this modeling software in the different countries, sponsored by the ministry, sponsored by the universities, to train people on how to use the model and how to think of different ways to cooperate. Stakeholder participation, data collection, visiting dam sites, understanding how each and every reservoir operates in reality. Spending a lot of time doing this visiting. The schematic of the model looks like this. And so it represents all the major reservoirs, and of course, a simplified hydrology in many ways. It does not include Lake Victoria, the equatorial lakes, but it includes these lump diversions all around. And we make assumptions as to how much water is diverted, and we'll get into that. So some of the hydrology scenarios. So one way of doing this, a traditional method, is to think of wet, dry, average hydrologies. And many studies do this. And often they use a drought of record. So I consider this insufficient. It's the selection of a hydrology is subject to bias. Depends on what type of hydrology you select. Could bias the study. So a better way to do this is to use many, many scenarios. And so we have a probabilistic look on what the chances are of a drought, or what the chances are of shortages. A risk-based analysis. So 2 different ways: an index sequential method, where we start every time in history could repeat itself. We can talk about technical details, or a synthetically generated stochastic hydrology. But it's ways to look at many, many different possible futures that could happen. So we use this index sequential method. So every year could represent, or the starting year of the Aswan of the GERD could represent any year in history, from 1900 to 2002. So it covers the wet periods, the dry periods, the average periods, and everything in between. The hydrology basis is a monthly reconstructed flows from 1900 to 2002. This was done by Deltares, a study in 2012, to generate the hydrology. They did a very good job. So I used the best hydrology within this model here. Okay, so the demand scenarios. We had a lot of conversation about this yesterday, so we don't want to get too much into it. But we'll say we make assumptions. You have to make assumptions in a model. And so during the filling period, only during the filling period, we assume that Ethiopia is essentially using 0. They use very little. Sudan assumes 16 million cubic meters on this. Now we talked about this yesterday, between 1,200 to 1,600. And what I'm going to say is that 4 billion cubic meters is very small when you're talking about impacts to the Aswan Dam. It's less than 4%. So we shouldn't get too wrapped up. That's an issue for Sudanese development, but not necessarily for system-wide impacts. These numbers are based on intro numbers, updated from some ministry numbers. Egypt, we assume 55.5 billion cubic meters, and this is the amount requested, how much they would like to use. Not necessarily what they're entitled to, I don't get into the legal aspects of it, but these are just assumptions that we use in the model. These are very easily adjusted with improved data. Give me better data, you can rerun the models. So, but these demands are assumed to remain unchanged throughout the filling period. So here's a cross-section of the model itself. Imagine an average of 49 billion cubic meters flows into the reservoir. The first part of it is 3 billion cubic meters to fill up to the intake of the turbines, to 560 meters. Above that, another 12 billion cubic meters to fill up to the minimum operational level of 590 meters. So this is the dead storage, so 15 billion cubic meters, and once it's filled to this level, it technically shouldn't drop below this level. Beyond that, the active storage is 59 billion cubic meters, and this will oscillate back and forth to regulate the flows to generate electricity. So in reality, these flows are not 49, they're going to vary somewhere between 21 to 73 is the historic range. So it's very, this is the stochastic, or the uncertain nature is what the inflows are going to be. Okay, so reservoir management scenario. So imagine water flowing in from Ethiopia, passing the border into Sudan, going through the cascade of reservoirs into Sudan. Part of that gets used here for the Jazeera scheme. The remainder goes on to fill into Egypt. And then Egypt generates electricity and supplies water to irrigation into Cairo. So when the Ethiopian reservoir fills, when the GERD fills, one of the options is an agreed annual release. How much water would they agree to release downstream every year throughout the filling process? The other key piece of information is how full is the Aswan Dam to start with at the beginning of the filling period. A very important piece of information. Another thing is how will Egypt operate the High Aswan Dam during this scenario? And how will Sudan operate their reservoirs during this scenario? So there's many things to think about and to analyze, and many different ways to solve this problem. So if there's an agreed annual release, this is a basic level of cooperation. It is a breakthrough to agree to a certain release to guarantee flows downstream. Okay, so the different dimensions to evaluate: agreed annual releases from the GERD, the starting elevation of the High Aswan Dam, the operations of the High Aswan Dam, and operations of the Sudanese reservoirs. Many different things to look at. Okay, so some of the results to start with, at different agreed annual releases through the bottom here. This essentially is no agreement, and this is 25 billion cubic meters, 30, 35, 40, 45 billion cubic meters. And this is the range of time to fill up the reservoir. So if it's filled up with no agreement, essentially it's 2 to 3 years, very, very quickly. But if they agree to something here, the middle line represents the average, and this is the range of possible. So it could be 5 years, 6 years, somewhere in there, depending on, and obviously over here, that would be unacceptable to Ethiopia because it potentially could take decades to fill. So this is the range. Okay, so what's the benefits of the GERD? So this is the energy generation of the 3 different countries under different agreements and under a short-term, medium-term impact. So the first 10 years and then the 11 to 30 years after the filling begins. So you can see the benefits to Ethiopia, 15, so this is gigawatt hours per year. And then Sudan, they get the benefits of the uplift effect, so they get a little bit of extra. And this is the cost to Egypt, the reduced amount of energy generated by the High Aswan Dam due to a lower level. So this gives us an idea of the magnitude of the costs and the benefits in terms of electricity. Okay, what is it with the possibility of shortages to Egypt? On average, if you took all those average hydrologies, took all the average hydrologies, we can see there's always a possibility, as there is today, that there could be shortages to Egypt. It's always chances, but the question is, it's probabilities, it's not definites. So we can see that under different starting elevations of the Aswan Dam, along the timeline here, and under different operation scenarios, the chances of a shortage would generally start and then go down again after the reservoir is full. And the size of that possibility changes depending on the different parameters. But averages don't mean a lot in hydrology because there's nothing that ever is average. So what we really have to look at is chances. So if you start out with one of the elevations, 175, what is the probability of exceeding a certain shortage amount? And what this shows us here is there's a very low chance that there could be a shortage. However, the shortages could be very high. So this is changing our thinking in terms of not binary black and white, but we're talking about a low probability of a potential high shortage. Even upwards of 10, 15, 20 billion cubic meters. So again, a low probability of a shortage, but potentially high consequences. So we have to think in terms of probability. On average, there isn't a shortage. But on a low probability, there could be a shortage. So what is an acceptable risk? This is the real question. What's an acceptable risk?
Kevin?
Yes, sir.
2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so really the best way to look at this is let's look at the pool elevation of the Aswan Dam. So here, every year they have to get below 175 meters. So they always have to bring the reservoir down. And they never want to go below 147 meters, or the turbines have to shut down. They have to make very large reductions in deliveries to Egypt. So it oscillates to this level. If the reservoir hits 147 meters, that's not a good thing for the Aswan Dam. So the question is, what is the probability of getting to this low level? Okay, I want you to notice here, in 2015, there was no flood on the Aswan, on the Nile. The operators of Meroe noted this. The water did not spike up again during this period, very dry year. Okay, so what is the probability of reaching that low elevation level? Well, if the reservoir starts up fairly full, there's a fairly low probability, 5%, 7%. But as the reservoir starts out lower, as the Aswan Dam starts out lower, those probabilities increase of the chance of hitting the bottom. Now, still, these are less than 50%, so on average hydrology, it would not hit this level. But however, if it's a dry hydrology, as we've known, as the IWRA pointed out, there's always a chance it could happen. So the question is not yes impact, no impact. The question is, what is the chances? Because we know that the inflows of the GERD are probabilistic. Okay, thank you. Okay, so finally here, the Aswan Dam is not going to operate blindly. They're going to reduce their uses proactively to try to avoid hitting this bottom level. So reducing by 5%, 10%, and 15% as the reservoir level drops. So this is their response. So what does that do? Well, that avoids some of the possibilities of running into shortages or hitting that bottom level, reduces the numbers, reduces the percentiles or the probabilities. But however, what I want to say is there's better ways to operate too. If the countries work closer together, we can imagine as the reservoir level in Egypt drops down too low, what if there was a minimum level you wanted to protect in Egypt? That nobody wants the high Aswan Dam to drop too low, below 150 meters. We have a reservoir upstream that can supply that. So if this happens, what if Ethiopia made an emergency or a safeguard release to back up the Aswan Dam? Releases extra water and refills the bottom. Make sure that it never goes below that critical level. So this is using the GERD to protect the Aswan Dam. This is a continuous, a higher level of cooperation. Okay, so finally, a continuous coordination, agreed annual release. Egypt implements their drought management plan and they use the GERD to back the Aswan Dam. Requires agreement from all the countries. What does this look like? We're able to reduce those probabilities of shortage down to essentially zero. If the countries work together to come to an agreement, we can reduce these probabilities, these scary-looking probabilities, down to essentially zero if the countries are willing to work together. And we can reduce the chances of getting these high probabilities, or these high shortages, down to essentially zero. Okay, so finally the way forward, we're going to shift from a binary to a risk-based thinking in this thinking. There's a very strong argument for cooperative agreements, and information sharing is absolutely critical with this. Downstream planning depends on the sharing of the upstream GERD data, and Ethiopia can only support Sudan and Egypt if they have the downstream data. They can only help Egypt if they have the downstream data. So sharing data is critical for cooperative management. Withholding data is self-harmful. Okay, so a new era requires new norms of cooperation.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Kevin decided to talk from over there because I would have less control on him.